Oh, gee. What am I bid? I call the Honourable Member Jacinda Ardern. Sorry, guys.
Thank you. I smiled a lot. Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's my first call on the State Sector and Public Finance Reform Bill, and I'm pleased to have an opportunity to speak to Part 1. I'm pleased also to know how many opportunities I have to speak on Part 1 because it is an extensive part, and I think probably the points that I have to make will take some time. I want to start with some of the recommendations and comments that were made by the Select Committee in Part 1, particularly around the purpose of the Act, Mr. Chair, because from someone who obviously did not sit on this committee, some clarification from the Minister and the Chair on some issues would be beneficial to myself and perhaps to other members of the House. In particular, the recommendation around amending Clause 5, Section 1AE of the Act. There was obviously some debate amongst members of the Select Committee around the wording in the objective, and if I could flick to the purpose clause, of the bill, Mr. Chair, in 1A, it says the purpose of this Act is to promote and uphold a state sector system, and then goes on to list the things that it is required by the Act that are upheld. An important question, I think, though, is to what degree does uphold become defend? To what degree actually does upholding then transition into defending when there is potential for the erosion of certain objectives for the state sector? And I say that because when we come down to the area where there obviously was some debate by Select Committee members at E, where the wording has been changed from provides for to is supported by effective workforce and personnel arrangements. Now, as that currently stands on the face of it, it sounds like it's almost a passive role the State Sector Act is in that regard. But obviously I come at this from looking at an area of the state sector like the Ministry of Social Development, like those who are working in child, youth and family as public sector servants. And to what degree is this Act to defend the role that they have when they are no longer able to act as an effective workforce because of workplace issues, for instance? What role is there for intervention in order to support that workforce? Now, what do I mean by that? Well, we know because the government has pursued what it calls at various times it's called capping, it's called streamlining, it's been called efficiencies, it's been called various things, but let's cut to the chase of what it's meant. It's meant that in some of our departments, despite demand and workforce demands increasing for those departments, that has outstripped their ability as a workforce to grow and meet that demand. Now, for child, youth and family, for instance, in the past several years alone, there's been a 33% increase in notifications that require substantiated notifications. So notifications that require further action. Over that period, per annum, we've had 16 new social workers. Now, one might be able to claim that it's very difficult for that workforce to be an effective workforce under those circumstances, to fulfil their requirement as public servants to act appropriately and according to their own acts that they are required to fulfil and be governed by. So what degree is this an act about just upholding a state sector system, and to what degree is it one that is able to defend it when that position becomes untenable for them? Mr. Chair, the second part that I wanted to speak to relates to Chief Executive's ability to delegate functions or powers. This was obviously in Clause 35, another area of contention and discussion for the Select Committee. In particular, I see they've distinguished between public service chief executives being able to delegate functions or powers from, of course, the separate ability to contract out the delivery of services. I'd like to hear from the Minister and the Chair, though, what they would see, what examples she may have of those distinctions between, obviously, the contracting out of services, which happens daily within government departments, and other forms of delegation that might occur by a chief executive. To just give a little flavour to the kinds of circumstances we might be looking at, which would be important for us to consider, because I think it's right that we be concerned when we are delegating any powers to ensure it's done properly. Now, the reason I imagine a select committee said, look, contracting's distinct, is because we assume transparency. We assume that through the contracting system, because it's tendered, and because, Mr Chair, because it's tendered, because to a certain degree, of course, the portals that the government provides are meant to be a process that even the public who may not be engaging in those particular contract arrangements are at least able to see. My concern is that in recent times, perhaps our trust, even the Select Committee's trust that we can treat the contracting out, that form of delegation by a chief executive to be sacrosanct and fine, actually maybe we need to question whether or not we still actually have that layer of transparency within that tendering process. Now, the reason I question that is because in recent times, for instance, very recently, we discussed at the Social Services Select Committee, the Welfare Reform Bill, where significant parts of the Social Security Act, Mr Chair, for the first time was being delegated to external agencies. For the first time, we were seeing the administration of welfare payments, particularly as they related to young people, being taken out of the Social Security Act and delegated to contractors. We're now seeing a second stage of that. We're now delegating the important role of support mechanisms for transitioning into work of mental health patients and the like, being delegated to contracted authorities. Now, we have very little transparency about how that's working. We couldn't get it through the Select Committee process. I've requested tender documents and I haven't seen it there. So the transparency, I think, in this Act that we assume through the delegation and contracting, I question whether or not that necessarily exists. Particularly, as I've said, for this latest set of delegation, because it's a very new delegated power in that regard, and one, given it's such a core service, that I think that we would be right to ensure that we do have that transparency. So as I say, I would be very interested to hear from the Minister in the Chair, the delegated functions and decision-making powers, the kinds of examples that may have been considered by the Select Committee. I'd be very interested to hear what they may have considered and what they consider to be carefully defined circumstances. I'll throw out one other example I query, for instance. The Ministry of Social Development established, under the leadership of the Minister, established a Work and Income Board recently. Now, that Work and Income Board actually is working directly with the Treasury. In fact, we have the bizarre circumstance now where the Ministry of Social Development is being asked to account directly to the Treasury on whether or not they are decreasing the actuarial valuation that's been done on the Ministry of Social Development around the overall cost of benefits. It's also having to report to a Work and Income Board which has delegated powers from the Minister. Now, not from the Chief Executive. This is an important point. This is where things get very murky. In fact, there were questions over whether the Chief Executive departed from her role because those delegated powers came directly from the Minister, and there were questions as to the hierarchy of who actually held seniority in that state. Is the Chief Executive reporting to the Work and Income Board, or is the Chief Executive reporting to the Minister of Social Development, and vice versa? It became very murky, Mr Chair. And so I would like some clarity, because we are seeing increasingly roles like this emerging, which have, this is a significant amount of power that Work and Income Board has now. And Paula Rebstock basically could, by virtue of being appointed to these boards, have delegated powers from almost every chief executive in the public service, the way that things are currently running. She is the one individual who seems to be delegated the power of everything. And so I would be interested to hear from the Minister on those situations, because we lacked clarity for a very long period of time, and we just can't afford to have that for a ministry as significant as the Ministry of Social Development. I note that the bill expanded on the range of conditions and restrictions where they are using delegated powers. So, for instance, after any delegation, a Chief Executive would have to report on it in the annual report and comment on its effectiveness. It's an interesting point, but again, how far does that extend? And just a little more, and I do completely acknowledge I wasn't on the Select Committee for this, so there actually may have been much more clarity on the Select Committee as to the circumstances where that would apply. But I would love to see that kind of requirement exist for some of the delegated powers that we've seen in more recent times. Mr. Chair, the restriction of redundancy payments in certain situations is another area which I think is extraordinarily interesting and worth a degree of clarification. Obviously, it's an area of much contention, and we've seen many times in the past couple of years where redundancy payments have caused some distress. Obviously,
the Honourable Damien O'Connor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.